Good evening, everyone. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Karen Gunn. Some of you were here last year when we were in this very room and we talked about this subject of truth decay and misinformation, and we're back at it this year. And before we start the program, I'd like to begin with three actually really important acknowledgments to help us set the container, so to speak. First, we respectfully recognize that the land on which Santa Monica College stands is the ancestral, unceded territory of the Tongva and Chumash peoples. We honor the indigenous caretakers of these lands, their elders in the past, the present, and the future. The second acknowledgement that I'd like to make is that we brought this event to you and to our community on the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. It's a solemn day in the history of the United States and provides us all an opportunity to pause and reflect. To the first responders, those who lost loved ones, and everyone who is affected by the tragedy, we all stand together with you. There were certainly many ripple effects that divided our families and our communities, our nation, and the world in the aftermath of that tragedy. We honor the deep service, the sacrifice, and the loss that resulted from 9/11. We know that words matter. We seek to listen. We're working towards more unity and compassion for each other as we continue to remember. And third, and finally, no surprise, we're in the midst of a contentious election season. So last night, many of you watched a historic presidential debate. Others of you were at city council meetings or community meetings, and others of you were just trying to keep life going and take care of yourself and your families. The point is, we all come to community sessions like this and spaces having really different experiences and different information. We hold a range of opinions and concerns, and we draw varying conclusions about each other and how we'll engage during something like election season. We quickly become enemies and we pit ourselves against other people. So this event is not a partisan political activity or event. It's not intended to promote any particular candidates or positions. And it's really a chance, rather, for you to engage and open your hearts and your minds. Indy opened us up with his beautiful music that hopefully begins to center us, and to really tune in to things that may challenge your thinking. And we hope you walk out with some better understanding of yourself and others, even those people who you may disagree with. So that's not easy for any of us, but we know that without that, we can't be the healthy community that we all want and deserve.
Welcome, everyone. She's making me laugh. It's good to see some former colleagues, some current colleagues, a lot of SMC folks are in the house. This is my place almost of worship because I was a professor here. So I want to say thank you to SMC, the Board of Trustees, everyone who helped us to make this happen and to give us this beautiful space in this brand new shiny building on Pico. And I want to recognize our HRC members, some of whom are not here today, but it would be great for you all to know who the hot shots are in the room, starting with us. And so if the HRC folks that are here could just raise their hands. And if you have an issue to complain about, you can also speak to them afterwards. So the program, you have it, and it does explain what we're going to be doing this evening. And I think it is noteworthy that many people across generations are speaking to this issue of But this is my way of suggesting to you that if your phone is on, please turn it off. Now, if you want to dance, come backstage. And I thank you. Okay. Okay, next slide, please. So, you know these people. Next slide, Gunner. My Gunner's there. One more, please. This is us. Good show. Human Relations Council, this is our 20th year. It is our 20th year as the Santa Monica Bay Area Human Relations Council, and we evolved from the National Conference on Christians and Jews that became the National Conference on Community and Justice, and then we decided we were going to be our own. And we have been around for 20 years, and you can see what our focus is. It has evolved over time. The times have required that we evolve because of the dynamics of our social political environment. And indeed, across generations, many people are talking about information, misinformation, and particularly disinformation, the malicious, intentional putting out there of data. Everyone has spoken to it, so it is interesting that I could share a quote that the simplest way to combat misinformation is with truth. That's been said by many folks, most recently by Taylor Swift. So, and you know, Kendrick Lamar, I'm sure will roll in with something about that as well. So we have two keynote speakers, one by video, Dr. Ray Block, and then that will be followed by Dr. John, in the right place at the right time, Rogers. And then we're going to have some incredibly creative, thought-provoking sessions, and if you have signed up, you have probably signed up for one of them, you've made a choice. One suggestion we'll make is that whatever choice you made, stay there. You might want to do the happy dance, but don't do the happy feet and move from one to the other. We'd like you to stay focused. And then we will come back towards the end for some action steps from one of those, from each of the groups. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Michael Rich. Dr. Michael Rich, along with his collaborators, is the author of the book Truth, Decay, formerly CEO of RAND Corporation. RAND has been here to support us. Dr. Ray Block sits in the chair that is the distinguished chair at RAND for Truth, Decay. With all that said, next one, Gunner. Let's hear the video from him. Dr. Block could not be here because of competing commitments, but he has a very interesting, short, sweet, and focused presentation for us that identifies some of the issues. And for those of you who are interested in reading any more about him, he has 2 articles that I believe we have out on the table that you can take if you like. One of them is entitled Black Americans Aren't Buying Election Year Falsehoods, period. Here's why, period. And the next one is Truth, Decay is a Threat to Democracy. Here's what you can do to help.
Hello, and welcome to today's event, Countering Truth Decay, a community conversation. The focus of today's event is to talk about the impact of misinformation on local issues and community-led solutions. I was lucky enough to attend an event like this last year, and I wanted to be involved this year because of RAND's mission and commitment to rigorous, nonpartisan research that helps to inform policy and decision-making. My own passion for exploring the concept of truth decay is a key area of RAND's research. My remarks, therefore, will be about what truth decay is and why it's relevant to this community discussion. So, what is truth decay? We define it as the diminishing role of facts, data, analysis, and expertise in public life. And this pattern shows up in a host of places, from politics and policy making to even education. Here's a quick outline of what I plan to cover when I talk about truth decay. First, I'll share Rand's overall framework for making sense of it and explain why truth decay matters in our communities. Second, I will follow that up by celebrating some of the really cool work being done by myself and my colleagues that takes a community level approach to understanding truth decay. And finally, because of how serious this problem is, I want to offer some words of optimism and express my gratitude for being able to participate in community dialogues like this one. So some key concepts. At RAND, we think of truth decay as an overall system containing contributions or drivers, indicators or trends, and effects or consequences. These things are interconnected, and I want to talk specifically about two elements of truth decay: misinformation and disinformation. The difference between these terms is a matter of intent. You can think of misinformation as false information that spreads without malicious intent, and you can think of disinformation as deliberate attempts to mislead and confuse. Now that we have a sense of what truth decay is, let's talk about how it hits different parts of our society. I like to think of this as the micro, the meso, and the macro level. Now, the reason why this is important is because meso-level research on truth decay emphasizes that truth decay isn't just a national issue, but that it also affects local communities, public health, education, local governance, and other things that are affected when facts become less central to decision making. In fact, my own research points out specific local issues, for example, health and safety and the economy, where misinformation can have exacerbating challenges. Now, the role and context of this meso-level research is what we're going to discuss now. And I'll be honest with you, there are many research projects to choose from because my colleagues are doing amazing work. But in the interest of time, I will lift up 3 recent examples here, focusing specifically on what these publications tell us about the importance of community-led events in combating misinformation, the value of dialogue in fostering mutual understanding and rebuilding trust in information sources, and how building media literacy skills is essential and local communities have an opportunity to lead in efforts in educating people and about how to critically evaluate information. For example, the op-ed in The Hill emphasizes that Black American communities are effectively combating misinformation through grassroots efforts, open dialogue, and media literacy, which collectively help to rebuild trust and enhance critical information evaluation skills. The report on the upcoming election underscores that local community-led efforts, dialogue between officials, and enhanced media literacy are essential for combating disinformation and safeguarding election integrity by improving public awareness and trust. The piece about older populations highlights that when it comes to combating misinformation, older adults benefit more from community-led education and dialogue as opposed to apps and gamified interventions, which emphasizes the need for targeted media literacy efforts within local communities to help them to critically evaluate information. For those who are interested, each of these publications and many others are available online from the RAND website. I admit that I'm an optimist, but I am not naive. I acknowledge the sheer scale of the challenge. But again, I emphasize that community-led initiatives like this event are essential for countering truth decay. So what can we as members of our communities do about truth decay? Perhaps these strategies will help. I would recommend that we always be skeptical of questionable claims. Use digital resources to check facts. Don't just be a passive consumer of information. Feel empowered. And discuss information with friends, family, and diverse perspectives to avoid isolation and, more importantly, to broaden your understanding. Thank you, Santa Monica, for your commitment to tackling this issue. RAND will continue to support these kinds of initiatives with research, resources, and guidance. RAND's work, of course, is ongoing, and events like this provide critical insight into how further research and action in local communities can work. So again, welcome to this important event. I am sure that I am missing out on a great conversation today, and I am sure that many great things will come from this community dialogue. and they have to, because I hope that many more conversations will come from this. Truth decay is a big problem, and it will take sustained effort to address it.
Ray's been really great to work with. As Karen said, he's at Penn State and he's doing some interesting work there, and it's been really interesting to sort of forge a partnership with someone who's doing this work. So more on that to come. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. John Rogers. John is the information about John and all the speakers are in your programs. And John is the co-founder and the director of UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access, or IDEA. Throughout his distinguished career, he's designed and led a range of projects to engage and learn from educators, parents, and students. His work focuses on the context of political conflict and how, in the midst of this conflict, we can educate for a diverse and multiracial democracy, the world that we're in. And in doing so, how we promote a sense of belonging that we all want and we all deserve. So John and his family live here in Santa Monica. They've raised their kids here, went through the public schools, and you can learn more about him, as I said, in your program. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Rogers.
Thank you, Julie. It is wonderful to be here today in Santa Monica, in my neighborhood, speaking with you. It's also wonderful to be here for this group. I had one of my most important formative experiences as a 17-year-old back in 1978 with NCCJ, which used to bring together young people from across greater Los Angeles for a retreat, a week-long retreat, where people from different races came together and talked about issues of race, issues of racial justice. And I had my truth challenged in ways that broadened my understanding and changed my view of the world and what was possible. And that was profoundly important. So I have immense gratitude to NCCJ and all that they did back then and all that they continue to do in this community gathering today. I'm also remembering my formative experiences in Santa Monica in the late 1990s, learning with the great Dr. Sylvia Rousseau, who was the principal of Santa Monica High School. Some of you remember her leadership then. She enacted a vision of multiracial democracy, and that high school opened up space for young people to talk with one another, to talk with their educators, for security guards to have conversations with young people about what it meant to be safe and how we create safety. That's how we create truth in this deeper sense where we're constructing it together. And so I'm thinking about both of those ideas today.
You can just say
Next slide, thank you. So I want to begin by both acknowledging and expressing my appreciation for the metaphor of truth decay, but also inviting us to think about how we might want to stretch beyond that metaphor. And the reason for that comes out of the research I've been doing about some of the targeting and challenging and conflict that's been set upon public schools all across the United States over the last several years. One of the things that we've seen as we've studied those conflicts and what I would describe as conflict campaigns is that there is a great deal of misinformation and disinformation that is spread constantly. At the same time, it's not spread in a way that invokes for me the metaphor of tooth decay. Like, I can't help but thinking about sitting in the dentist chair and leaning backwards, right? And getting the bad news. And when that happens, it always feels like I individually am being blamed for a process that I have very little control over. And when I think about what has been happening in American public schools over the last few years, there's a difference there. There has been coordinated, purposeful efforts to advance misinformation and disinformation that's targeted vulnerable groups. It's targeted racial minorities. It's targeted queer youth. And it's been purposeful in the sense that it is aimed to undermine community trust, and it ultimately is aimed to garner partisan advantage. There's been a lot of money behind it, a lot of resources from certain conservative philanthropies and from highly resourced conservative legal foundations. So it's purposeful, it's organized, it's coordinated. And that's a very different image than I think about when I think about myself sitting back in the dentist's chair. So I want to share a little bit of that research. And as I do so, I want to make two different points that I think it's important as we think about these attacks on truth, to think about the ways in which they're part of what I would describe as anti-democratic mobilization. And I also think it's important to consider what we're trying to create when we think about rebuilding trust and fostering truth. I think what we're trying to create is the multiracial democracy that we still have not realized here in the United States. Next slide, please. So, as I'm talking about this vision of educating toward a multiracial democracy, I'm just going to start with the next slide. And this comes out of a concept paper that I created with some colleagues at UC Riverside and then my wonderful colleague Veronica Tariquez, who directs the Chicano Studies Center at UCLA. So the next slide just has the beginning where we talk a little bit about what we have in mind when we think about educating toward a multiracial democracy in California. We start by saying California is home to more than 9 million precious children and youth who, through their diverse identities, languages, and experiences, embody extraordinary potential. As a state, we must provide rich opportunities for young people to understand and tap into these cultural resources. We have a responsibility to enhance their creative and intellectual capabilities and foster their respect for and deep connection to one another and the land that sustains us all. And because young people today face unprecedented social and environmental challenges, it's imperative that they develop the civic skills and commitments necessary to build complex alliances, address shared problems, and envision a more promising future. In short, we must educate towards a diverse, multiracial democracy. So as I think about what we're trying to do when we're combating this misinformation, disinformation, that's the image I have in mind. Now, I'm hoping we may have some time in a little bit to come back to this and say, well, what's your image? Because I think we have to create that image of the multiracial democracy together. Next slide, please. So continue, please. I'm just going to skip beyond this so we can. I'm starting with one principal's story who says, I believe in this educating toward a multiracial democracy, but I'm getting all this misinformation. So continue down. Unfortunately, there's like 3 pieces here. And so he's just talking about an angry mob who's spreading this misinformation. The next slide. If you can go to the next slide, please. There we go. Okay. So in order to try to make sense of these stories we were hearing from school leaders, in the summer of 2022, we did a nationally representative survey with high school principals. Some 500 principals responded, and we also did a survey with 150 high school principals in California to get a sense of how things were playing out. And as we did this, we placed each of the schools that these principals were from in their congressional districts, and we looked to see whether those congressional districts leaned toward the Democratic Party, leaned toward the Republican Party, or somewhere in between, whether they were blue, red, or purple in how we often talk. And we wanted to see whether their location in particular partisan contexts shaped the experiences of conflict and what was going on in those schools. And we did the same for California, even though California has very few red communities. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is what we asked. Go to the next slide again. Okay. So 4 quick things that we found. One thing that we found is that political conflict was pervasive across these schools, but it was particularly evident in schools that were located in these politically contested communities. This one principal saying, my high school faced the whole conspiracy theory that COVID was not real, you don't need to wear face masks, the people are sheep, we're all dupes to the federal government. And she goes on to talk about how stressful this was and the anger and the vitriol that was coming out. In the next slide, we see that misinformation was playing out, and it was increasing between 2018 and 2022 generally, but it was particularly increasing in these politically contested purple communities. This didn't come out of nowhere. There was targeting that was going on in which various different right-wing philanthropies, legal foundations, and then what were called grassroots organizations like Moms for Liberty were focused on trying to make a difference in these politically contested communities. And so they put much of their energy into directing conflict in towards certain areas. And so you can see how in purple communities, there's a threefold rise almost in the extent to which principals were reporting that parents and community members were spreading misinformation or disinformation. Next slide. So one thing that was happening was increased conflict, and it was increasing particularly in purple communities. A second thing that was happening is that as the community members were talking in these conflictual, hostile, and often violent ways, there was more incivility playing out amongst young people and more intolerance playing out amongst young people. I have a couple data points here about that. I want to point out that much of that intolerance was being targeted towards African American students in particular, and toward LGBTQ youth in particular. And oftentimes in those communities where community members and parents were acting most hostilely around those issues, young people were then enacting it as they engaged with their classmates. Next slide. A third finding is that this political conflict, not surprisingly, had a deep impact on educators. It both increased the stress substantially and decreased the social trust that was playing out amongst the educators. The next slide. And then the fourth thing that we see is what we describe as a chilling effect, that in many cases, educators faced with increased conflict backed away from teaching about issues of race and racism, backed away from even teaching current events. And as you see in this slide, there's a real difference in what young people are being taught. And so when young people are taught fundamentally different things in different communities, what shared truth is there going to be as they talk with one another, as they become adults? Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? What can be done so that we can educate toward a multiracial democracy, a diverse multiracial democracy, even amidst these efforts to foment conflict, and particularly to foment conflict for particular purposes? And I want to suggest a couple ideas that I know folks who are in this room already have in their heads, but I just want to kind of point them out as kind of signals to think about as we move forward. First, next slide. First, it is incredibly important for community leaders, and by this I mean young people and people in unofficial positions and people in official positions, to talk about the importance of a multiracial democracy, why it matters to them, why these values are important. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to do that. A second thing, the next slide, is to engage in bridging activity, to work to reach out and bridge to folks that you don't have relationships with, and to try to create opportunities for others to do the same. And if you hit the return again, there's a quote from John Powell, who speaks in powerful ways about issues of belonging. And one of the things that this quote brings out is the ways in which bridging is most powerful when it opens up opportunities for people to share their full selves, for people to share their full sense of humanity, their stories in a deeper way. And then the third slide, last slide, is opportunities to practice democracy. And here, I want to point to the idea that practicing democracy means more than engaging in electoral politics. It means more than just being in conversation with one another. It means in a fundamental way opportunities for people to come together and to address problems together, to feel like you're working together on problems that you jointly care about and that you have a shared stake in, so that in the course of practicing that work, you begin to understand one another and understand why it matters that you're in relationship to each other. Do I have a couple minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. I'm going to do one of the things I was going to do. So if we can go back to that number 1, so it's like 3 slides up. Thank you. Turn to your neighbors. Have a brief conversation about what for you is the value of a multiracial democracy. What does that value mean to you? How would you communicate that to your friends and neighbors? I'm wondering if anyone would like to share out the values that they've been talking about with the larger group.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this topic. So when I look at diverse multiracial democracy, the first thing that comes to mind is respect. And the challenge there is when we say multiracial, you're coming from different customs, beliefs, right, behaviors, practices, and a respect for that means that there is no superiority, no inferiority, no subordination, that we really are moving as equals. And one of the key components is being able to listen, to be able to pay attention as opposed to coming to the table with assumptions.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Anyone else? Please.
I was just sharing with our share that I always find it interesting in studying American history how we wouldn't even have this experiment without a spiritual movement that was started by Thomas Paine and his pamphlets, which were spiritual calls to action. Yet, we don't talk about multiracial in this context of spirituality. For example, when I brought my spirituality into government spaces, local government saying, hey, in our culture, in my spirituality, you don't leave anybody behind. Everybody gets taken care of. That's part of the spirituality, but that's not integrated. Our spiritual values are not integrated into democracy. Oftentimes it's used by one side, but the other side ignores the spiritual values. I just want to bring that context into diversity.
Thank you so much. I think this is why we need to have dialogues with multiple different voices who are going to challenge us and bring ideas that weren't part of the conversation. So thank you so much.
Hi, thank you. Something that we discussed in our group is showing up. Going into spaces communicates to a community that I have the willingness to learn and to share. Now, when that happens, we don't know. It's just a matter of what's happening in the environment, but my willingness to show up would be a way to communicate that.
One of the things that I hear you speaking to is that democracy requires a certain faith in listening, and that evokes this sense of spirituality. So you really are bringing together the different ideas we've heard. Anyone else? Yes.
In our group, something that we talked of that kind of generalizes equalizes all of our voices. One was community and empowerment and our voice, which was centered all around, some communities don't feel generally heard, and that leaves them out of the picture and, the political, center. And one of the biggest things that we kind of focused and all agreed on in our group was empowerment. And David can elaborate more about it since he had a great explanation on it.
Yeah, I suppose, personally, I kind of grew up more towards the south side of LA, and then I attend school here at SMC. And I feel like one thing that's important is that there's a sense of faith and optimism in democracy and the political process. One thing that I saw growing up was a very deep-rooted cynicism about politics, that there's no real point to voting or engaging because the system is corrupt. And while we should acknowledge that in a lot of cases these attitudes are because of decades or centuries of targeted suppression, we also should communicate that people's voices do matter, and that we should work to make sure that people feel they're able to engage in the process in a constructive way.
So I'm going to shift it back to Julia. As you all go out into the small groups, it seems that being attentive to these issues of power, to questions about history, to faith, to listening, and to spirituality would be a great starting point. Thanks, everybody.